I'm a firm believer in loyalty, especially when it comes to relationships. My friend Sarah and I have been inseparable since college, and we've supported each other through thick and thin. We've celebrated each other's successes, consoled each other through breakups, and navigated the often complicated waters of adulthood together. So when Sarah got engaged, I was over the moon for her. She had finally found someone who seemed to truly appreciate her, and I thought they would make a beautiful life together. But everything changed when I found out about her affair. It was a typical Wednesday when I heard the news. Completely by accident, a mutual friend casually mentioned it during lunch, and my heart sank. I immediately reached out to Sarah, hoping it was just a misunderstanding. But when I confronted her, she confirmed it. She had cheated on her fiancé with someone from work. The betrayal was staggering. I felt a mix of anger and disappointment. How could she do this? Sarah seemed genuinely remorseful, but she also had a cold, steely resolve when she spoke about her plans to marry him anyway. She said he deserved to be happy, and that was her justification for going through with the wedding, despite what she had done. After our conversation, I was left reeling. I couldn't fathom how she could reconcile the two parts of herself: the friend who stood by me during my rough times, and the person who would betray the trust of someone who loved her. I couldn't support her decision to marry someone she had cheated on, and I knew I had to stand my ground. When I told her I wouldn't support the wedding, she was furious. "You're being judgmental," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I need you now more than ever." But my heart was heavy with the knowledge of her betrayal. I tried to explain that supporting her meant condoning her actions, which felt like a betrayal of its own. I thought about her fiancé, the sweet man who had no idea of the infidelity, and how devastating it would be for him if she went through with the wedding. After that conversation, the fallout was immediate. Sarah began telling mutual friends about what happened between us, twisting my words to paint me as the villain. Some of our friends agreed with her, saying I was being too harsh and that I should be more supportive. They argued that relationships are complicated and that everyone makes mistakes. But to me, this was not just a mistake, it was a fundamental breach of trust. Every day felt like an emotional roller coaster. I had thought Sarah would be the kind of person who would own up to her mistakes and do the right thing. Instead, I felt like I was watching someone I cared about throw their life away for the sake of maintaining a facade. I was losing my best friend over this, and it broke my heart. I spent countless nights wrestling with my thoughts. Should I reach out and try to salvage our friendship? Was I really in the wrong for standing up for what I believed in? I thought about the memories we shared and how I had always been there for her, even when she made poor choices. But this felt different. This felt like a betrayal not just of her fiancé but of our friendship too. As the wedding date drew closer, I became increasingly uneasy. I felt like I was standing at a precipice, watching as Sarah prepared to jump into a relationship that was built on dishonesty. I decided to give her one last chance to reconsider, hoping she would realize the impact of her choices. I reached out and suggested that she take some time to think about everything before going through with the wedding. But she brushed me off, saying she didn't want to dwell on the past and that she was ready to move forward. It felt like she was trying to erase the mess she had created, and I couldn't be a part of it. I felt trapped in a situation where my values and beliefs were being tested. When the day of the wedding finally arrived, I knew I wouldn't be attending. I felt a mix of sadness and relief. I had lost a friend, but I had also stood up for what I believed in. I hoped she would find the clarity she needed, but I couldn't be the one to support her in something I thought was fundamentally wrong. Days turned into weeks, and while I tried to move on, Sarah kept reaching out, desperate to rekindle our friendship. But every time she contacted me, I felt the anger resurface. I didn't want to rehash the past, I wanted to move forward. It was a difficult position to be in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she had betrayed not just her fiancé but our friendship too. Eventually, I had to accept that I might never get the friendship back that I once had with Sarah. The betrayal ran too deep, and I didn't think I could ever look at her the same way again. I had lost a part of myself in this whole ordeal, but I also knew I had to protect my own heart. The love and support I had always given her didn't extend to condoning her actions. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I found solace in knowing that I had stood firm in my beliefs. I wasn't the villain in this story. I was just someone who valued integrity and loyalty. And while it hurt to lose a friend, I knew I had to prioritize my own well-being. In the end, I realized that some friendships are not meant to withstand the tests of life. Especially when those tests involve betrayal and dishonesty. I had to let go of the past and focus on creating a future that aligned with my values. It was time to move on and find peace, even if it meant saying goodbye to someone I had once considered a sister.
I'm a 36-year-old man, and for 5 years, I've been married to my wife, who is 34. At the start, I knew her family was a bit much, but I thought I could navigate it. I've always been the type to value boundaries and respect in relationships. And I believed we could create that together. However, as time went on, it became painfully clear that her family's toxicity was something I couldn't ignore. From the beginning, they were constantly involved in our lives. It started with the little things, showing up unannounced, always expecting to be included in our plans, and making unsolicited comments about how we managed our home. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just their way of showing love and concern. But as their behavior escalated, my irritation grew. The holidays were particularly stressful. Instead of enjoying our time together, my wife and I would find ourselves in the middle of family dramas. They would argue over trivial matters, bringing tension that made our gatherings feel more like obligations than celebrations. I tried to talk to my wife about setting some boundaries, but every time I brought it up, she would get defensive. "That's just how they are," she'd say, shrugging it off like it was no big deal. "You should just accept it." Over the years, it became a cycle of frustration. Her family meddled in our finances, suggesting how we should spend our money, often without any context of our actual financial situation. When we had kids, they didn't hesitate to try to control how we raised them. I remember one time at a family gathering when her mom openly criticized the way we were handling our toddler's nap schedule. It was humiliating to be undermined in front of everyone. Yet my wife sat silently as her mom picked apart our parenting choices. The final straw came a few weeks ago when her parents dropped by unexpectedly. I was in the middle of preparing dinner when they barged in. Instead of a friendly hello, they launched right into criticism, questioning why I hadn't done more around the house. I stood there, fuming. My wife just watched, her eyes darting between me and her parents. But she didn't say a word to defend me. I felt like a stranger in my own home. After they left, I confronted my wife about what had just happened. I felt betrayed and disrespected. I told her I couldn't keep living like this, constantly feeling belittled and undermined. But instead of acknowledging my feelings, she insisted I was overreacting and needed to lighten up. "They mean well," she said, brushing my concerns aside. That was the moment I knew I had to make a decision. I could no longer stay in a marriage where my feelings and boundaries were consistently ignored. I wanted a partner who would stand by me, who would fight for our family against external pressures rather than capitulating to them. I told her I wanted a divorce. Her reaction was immediate and emotional. She was upset, saying I was tearing the family apart. But I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The thought of being free from the constant drama and the weight of her family's expectations lifted a burden I had been carrying for too long. In the weeks that followed, we went through the motions of separation. I packed up my belongings and moved into a small apartment nearby. I began to focus on myself, rediscovering my hobbies and interests that had taken a backseat during our marriage. I started working out again and even took up cooking, which I had once enjoyed before the chaos of family life consumed my time. However, I felt a mixture of guilt and sadness. My wife reached out, expressing her hurt and confusion. She said I was making a mistake and that we could have worked things out if I had just given it more time. But deep down, I knew I had already given it my all. I had tried for years to make our relationship work despite the mounting pressures from her family. But each time I'd been met with resistance. As I settled into my new life, I began to think about what the future might hold. I had envisioned a life where I could establish my own boundaries without the chaos of external family influence. I spent time with friends who were incredibly supportive and reminded me that prioritizing my own mental health was not just okay, but necessary. Despite my newfound freedom, I sometimes found myself reflecting on my marriage. I wondered if there had been a way to bridge the gap between my wife and me regarding her family. But the truth was, I had always felt like an outsider looking in. Their bond was strong, almost impenetrable, and I had spent so long feeling like I was fighting a losing battle. Months passed, and I started to adjust to my new normal. I enjoyed the simplicity of my life, and though it was hard to let go of the dreams I had once had for my family, I began to realize that they were dreams built on a shaky foundation. I needed to prioritize my well-being, and if that meant letting go of the relationship I once cherished, then so be it. Eventually, I came to terms with my decision. I had stood up for myself in a way I never had before. And while it was painful to lose my wife, I knew it was a necessary step towards a healthier life. I began to rebuild my identity outside of my marriage, focusing on my interests and building a future that aligned with my values. In the end, I learned that standing up for myself was not an act of selfishness but a form of self-respect. I had the right to protect my emotional well-being and create boundaries that were essential for my happiness. While the road ahead was uncertain, I felt empowered to embrace the change and look forward to a brighter future.
I'm a 21-year-old woman, and I've been dating my boyfriend, who is 24, for about 6 months. Our relationship feels deeper than that because we've known each other for years and even dated in the past. Initially, everything seemed perfect. We shared so much history, and I thought we were on the same page when it came to our feelings and desires. However, a few months in, I started noticing something troubling in the bedroom. My boyfriend tends to finish quickly during sex, and while I've occasionally reached orgasm, it's becoming increasingly rare. I want to emphasize that I enjoy our intimacy. I love him and am generally satisfied with our sex life. I consider myself open-minded when it comes to physical connection, and I'm happy to explore vanilla sex. Yet, the fact that I haven't finished in weeks has started to weigh heavily on me. The other day, I decided to bring it up. I approached the subject gently, expressing my feelings and mentioning that it had been 3 weeks since I last reached orgasm. His response stunned me. He shrugged it off, saying, "It's not my fault I finish quickly," and then he added, "You have things you can use." Referring to my toys, I felt deflated. It was like he completely disregarded my needs. I tried to explain that there are things he could do to help me finish before we got to the main event. I wanted him to understand that sex is a shared experience, and I longed for him to be more involved in ensuring that both of us are satisfied. But he seemed dismissive, and it left me feeling frustrated and unheard. After reflecting on everything, I started to question whether it was fair to keep sleeping with him. I mean, why should I continue to engage in intimacy that only seems to benefit him? I could just as easily take care of my own needs without the complications of a relationship. That night, I lay in bed next to him, feeling a mix of affection and irritation. He looked so peaceful while he slept, and I was grateful for the sweet things he did for me outside of the bedroom, like bringing me flowers and telling me how beautiful I am. He had moved 2 hours away from home to live with me because I was struggling to afford rent on my own. And I appreciated that commitment. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that our sexual dynamic was off balance. In my frustration, I thought about what would happen if I did stop sleeping with him altogether. I imagined how he might react and how it would impact our relationship. Part of me wanted to see how he would handle a little distance, to understand if he would step up and take my needs seriously. I considered giving him one of my pocket toys and telling him, "Well, fair's fair," just to make a point. As I prepared for work the next day, I still hadn't made a decision. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads. On one hand, I didn't want to hurt him or disrupt the loving connection we had. But on the other hand, I felt a deep sense of injustice. I was tired of feeling like my needs were secondary to his. I went to work, and my mind kept drifting back to our situation. I replayed our conversations in my head, trying to think of the best way to address everything when I got home. Should I confront him again? Should I be more direct about my feelings? As the day dragged on, I felt increasingly anxious. I loved my boyfriend and didn't want to throw everything away lightly. But I also didn't want to settle for a relationship that didn't fulfill me. After all, intimacy is a crucial part of any romantic relationship, and I couldn't ignore the growing dissatisfaction. When I returned home, I decided to take a deep breath and talk to him. I wanted to express my feelings clearly, to see if he understood how important this was to me. As I walked through the door, I steeled myself for what lay ahead. I wanted to make sure I communicated my needs without sounding accusatory. This was about my feelings, not an indictment of his worth as a partner. While part of me wanted to give him a chance to redeem himself, another part of me was ready to stand firm on my boundaries. I knew I deserved to feel valued and satisfied in our relationship. I just hoped he could see that too. The ball was in his court, and I needed to know if he was willing to meet me halfway or if I had to take a step back for my own well-being. As I prepared for the conversation, I felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. I was determined to advocate for myself, but deep down, I still held on to the love I had for him. It was time to find out whether we could navigate this together or if it was time to reconsider our future.